On the morning of May 1, 1898, as dawn broke over Manila Bay in the Philippines, Commodore George Dewey stood on the bridge of his flagship, the USS Olympia, and prepared to engage the Spanish Pacific Fleet in battle. His squadron of American warships had sailed through the darkness, navigating the treacherous entrance to the bay under the guns of Spanish shore batteries. Now, as the sun rose and visibility improved, Dewey could see his target. The Spanish fleet was anchored in a defensive line off the Cavite naval station, about 5 miles away. There were 7 Spanish warships, several smaller gunboats, and the shore batteries to contend with. Dewey had 6 warships under his command. He was outnumbered in total vessels, but not in firepower or capability. What happened over the next 7 hours would be one of the most lopsided naval victories in military history. The American squadron would systematically destroy the entire Spanish Pacific Fleet without losing a single American sailor to enemy fire. Not one. The Battle of Manila Bay would announce to the world that the United States had arrived as a naval power. It would also entangle America in the Philippines for decades to come, with consequences that continue to shape our world today. This was not just a naval battle. It was a turning point in American history, the moment when the United States stopped being a continental power focused on its own borders and became a global empire with interests spanning the Pacific. To understand how this battle came to happen, you have to understand the strange circumstance that led an American naval squadron to attack a Spanish fleet on the other side of the world, in a place most Americans had never heard of. The Philippines had been a Spanish colony for more than 3 centuries. Spain had claimed the islands in the 1500s, named them after King Philip II, and ruled them as part of Spain's vast Pacific Empire. By 1898, that empire had shrunk considerably. Spain had lost most of its colonies in the Americas during the early 1800s. What remained were Cuba and Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and the Philippines and some smaller islands in the Pacific. These colonies were economically important to Spain, but they were also increasingly difficult to hold. Nationalist movements were growing. Local populations wanted independence. Spain was trying to maintain control with an outdated military and a weak economy. When the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor in February 1898 and the United States moved toward war with Spain, the question arose about what to do with Spain's Pacific possessions. The Philippines were thousands of miles from the primary theater of conflict in Cuba. They were not the reason America was going to war, but they represented an opportunity. If the United States could strike at Spanish forces in the Philippines, it would weaken Spain's overall position and potentially give America leverage in peace negotiations. There was also a more ambitious vision. Some American officials, particularly Assistant Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt, saw the Philippines as a potential base for American commercial and military power in Asia. China, with its massive population and market potential, was being carved up by European powers. American businesses wanted access to Asian markets. Controlling the Philippines could give the United States a foothold in the region. This is where Commodore George Dewey enters the story. Dewey was 60 years old in 1898, a career naval officer who had been in the Navy since before the Civil War. He had served on Union ships during that conflict, including the famous Hartford under Admiral David Farragut at the Battle of Mobile Bay. Dewey had learned his craft from one of the great naval commanders in American history. He was experienced, competent, and calm under pressure. He was also ambitious and politically connected. When the position of commander of the Asiatic Squadron came open in 1897, Dewey wanted it. The Asiatic Squadron was the U.S. Navy's fleet in the Pacific, based in Hong Kong. It was not the most prestigious command, and it was far from Washington, but Dewey understood that if war came with Spain, the Asiatic Squadron would have an important role to play. Dewey lobbied for the position. He used his connections, including Theodore Roosevelt, to make his case. He got the job and took command of the Asiatic Squadron in January 1898. At that point, war was not yet certain, but it was increasingly likely. Dewey began preparing. He drilled his crews relentlessly. He stockpiled ammunition and supplies. He gathered intelligence about Spanish forces in the Philippines. He studied charts of Manila Bay and the surrounding waters. Dewey was a planner. He believed in preparation. When war came, he wanted to be ready. The Asiatic Squadron that Dewey commanded consisted of 6 warships. The flagship was the USS Olympia, a protected cruiser of 5,800 tons. She was a modern ship, commissioned in 1895, armed with 4 8-inch guns, 10 5-inch guns, and numerous smaller weapons. The Olympia was fast, well-armored, and crewed by well-trained sailors. She was exactly the kind of ship that represented the new American Navy. The other cruisers in the squadron were the Baltimore, the Raleigh, and the Boston, all protected cruisers of various sizes and capabilities. There were also 2 gunboats, the Concord and the Petrel, which were smaller and less heavily armed but still useful for certain tasks. Finally, there were 2 support ships, the revenue cutter McCulloch and the supply ship Nanshan, which carried coal and provisions. It was not a huge fleet, but it was modern, well-maintained, and professionally commanded. The Spanish Pacific Fleet, by contrast, was in poor condition. The Spanish had 7 cruisers and several gunboats stationed at Manila. On paper, this looked like a respectable force, but appearances were deceiving. Most of the Spanish ships were old and poorly maintained. Their guns were outdated. Their ammunition was defective. The crews were undertrained and undermanned. Spain had been suffering from economic problems for years, and the Navy had been starved of funding. Ships that should have been retired or overhauled were kept in service because there was no money to replace them. This was a fleet that looked formidable in a harbor but would struggle in actual combat. The Spanish also faced a fundamental strategic problem. They were trying to defend the Philippines, which were thousands of miles from Spain, with no realistic prospect of reinforcement. If the Spanish fleet in Manila was defeated, there was no way to send another fleet. The nearest Spanish naval base was half a world away. The Americans, by contrast, had their base in Hong Kong, just a few days sailing from Manila. This meant that Dewey could prepare, concentrate his forces, and strike at a time of his choosing, while the Spanish could only wait and hope that war would not come. When the USS Maine exploded and war became inevitable, Dewey received a telegram from Theodore Roosevelt. This telegram, sent on February 25, 1898, before McKinley had even asked Congress for a declaration of war, ordered Dewey to prepare for offensive operations in the Philippines in the event of war with Spain. Roosevelt was technically overstepping his authority. He was just the assistant secretary, not the secretary himself, but he knew that the secretary, John D. Long, was out of the office that day. Roosevelt took advantage of Long's absence to send orders that positioned the U.S. Navy for an aggressive strategy. When Long returned and found out what Roosevelt had done, he was annoyed but did not countermand the orders. The instructions stood. Dewey was to keep his squadron together, make sure it was fully supplied and ready for action, and be prepared to attack the Spanish fleet in the Philippines as soon as war was declared. Dewey took these orders seriously. He knew that once war was declared, the British authorities in Hong Kong would enforce neutrality rules and require his fleet to leave. Hong Kong was a British colony, and Britain would not allow its territory to be used as a base for offensive operations by a belligerent power. Dewey needed to make sure he had everything he needed before that happened. He purchased additional coal and supplies. He arranged for the supply ship Nanchen to accompany the squadron. He drilled his crews even more intensively. He also sent intelligence officers to Manila to gather information about Spanish defenses. What Dewey learned was both encouraging and concerning. The Spanish fleet was weak, but Manila Bay was protected by shore batteries and possibly by mines. The entrance to the bay was narrow, guarded by fortifications on either side. There was Commodore Island at the mouth of the bay, which had guns, and there were batteries at the entrance channels. If these defenses were well maintained and well manned, they could make entering the bay dangerous. Mines were particularly worrying. A well-placed minefield could damage or sink ships before they even reached the Spanish fleet. Dewey would have to decide whether to enter the bay at night, when his ships would be harder to see, but when navigating would be more difficult, or during the day, when visibility would be better, but his ships would be easier targets. On April 24, 1898, Spain declared war on the United States. The next day, the U.S. declared war on Spain, backdating it to April 21. As expected, the British authorities in Hong Kong informed Dewey that he had 24 hours to leave. Dewey was ready. On April 27, the Asiatic squadron steamed out of Hong Kong harbor and headed south toward the Philippines. The journey would take about a week. Dewey used this time to finalize his plans and continue training his crews. The squadron stopped briefly at Manila Bay, a small anchorage on the Chinese coast about 30 miles from Hong Kong. Here, Dewey received final intelligence reports and made last-minute preparations. On April 30, the squadron departed Manila Bay and headed for Manila, about 630 miles away. As the ships steamed south through the South China Sea, Dewey gathered his officers and explained his plan. They would approach Manila Bay after dark and enter the bay at night. This was risky. Navigating through the narrow entrance in darkness, possibly under fire from shore batteries and with the threat of mines, was dangerous. But Dewey had decided that the risk was worth it. If they waited until daylight to enter, the Spanish would have more time to prepare, and the shore batteries would be more effective. The squadron arrived off the entrance to Manila Bay late in the afternoon of April 30. Dewey had the ships form a line-ahead formation, with the Olympia in the lead, followed by the Baltimore, Raleigh, Petrel, Concord, and Boston. The two supply ships, the McCulloch and Nanchen, followed at a distance. As darkness fell, the ships reduced speed and prepared to enter the bay. Every man was at battle stations. The gun crews were ready. Lookouts strained to see any sign of danger. The atmosphere on the ships was tense. The men knew they were about to enter hostile waters, and no one knew what would happen next. Around 11:30 p.m., the squadron began passing through Boca Grande, the southern channel leading into Manila Bay. This channel was wider and deeper than the northern channel, and Dewey had chosen it for that reason. The ships moved slowly and quietly. There were lights on Commodore Island and on El Fraile, a small island in the middle of the channel that had a fortification, but for a while nothing happened. The Spanish did not seem to have noticed the American ships slipping past in the darkness. Then at about 12:15 a.m. on May 1, the lead ship, the Olympia, was spotted. The Spanish batteries on shore opened fire. The sudden flash of guns lit up the night. Shells whistled through the air and splashed into the water around the American ships. Dewey ordered his ships not to return fire. There was no point in revealing their exact positions and wasting ammunition on shore batteries they could barely see. The Spanish shooting was wild and inaccurate. The gunners on shore were firing at the sound of the American engines and at the vague shapes they could see in the darkness. None of the shells hit. The American squadron passed through the channel and into Manila Bay without taking any damage. Once inside the bay, Dewey felt a sense of relief. The most dangerous part of the approach was over. The squadron had successfully navigated the entrance without being damaged by shore batteries or hitting any mines. Now they were in the bay, and at dawn they would find the Spanish fleet and engage it. Dewey ordered the ships to slow down and wait for daylight. There was no point in blundering around in the dark looking for the Spanish. Better to wait for dawn when they could see what they were doing. As the first light of dawn began to appear in the eastern sky around 5:00 a.m., lookouts on the American ships spotted the Spanish fleet. The Spanish ships were anchored in a line off the Cavite naval station on the southern shore of the bay, about 5 miles from where the American squadron had stopped. Cavite was the main Spanish naval base in the Philippines, and the Spanish commander, Admiral Montojo, had chosen to make his stand there. Montojo knew his fleet was outmatched. His ships were old and in poor condition. He did not have enough ammunition for a sustained battle. His crews were not as well trained as the Americans. He had decided to fight in shallow water near the shore so that when his ships were sunk, the crews could swim to safety and the ships could potentially be salvaged later. It was a defensive strategy born of weakness, not strength. The Spanish fleet consisted of 7 cruisers and several smaller gunboats. The largest ship was the Reina Cristina, Montojo's flagship, a steel cruiser of about 3,500 tons. She was 30 years old and armed with a mix of older guns. The other cruisers were the Castilla, which was an old wooden-hulled ship that had been condemned as unseaworthy but was pressed into service anyway, the Don Antonio de Aloa, the Don Juan de Austria, the Isla de Luzon, the Isla de Cuba, and the Marques del Duero. There were also several small gunboats, including the General Lizo, the Velasco, and the Argos. On paper, the Spanish had more ships than the Americans. In reality, they were heavily outgunned. The combined firepower of Dewey's modern cruisers far exceeded what the Spanish could bring to bear. Montojo also had shore batteries at Cavite, but these were not particularly effective. The guns were old, the ammunition was limited, and the positions were not well protected. There was also a question about mines. The Spanish had laid some mines in the approaches to Cavite, but many of them were old and possibly defective. As it turned out, the mines would play no significant role in the battle. At 5:15 a.m., with full daylight now illuminating the bay, Dewey gave the order to advance. The American squadron formed a line and steamed toward the Spanish fleet at a speed of 8 knots. The distance between the two fleets closed steadily. Dewey stood on the bridge of the Olympia, calmly observing the Spanish positions through his binoculars. At his side was the Olympia's captain, Charles Gridley. The crew was at battle stations. The gun crews were ready. The atmosphere was one of controlled tension. The men had trained for this moment. Now it was time to see if their training would pay off. As the American ships approached to within about 5,500 yards of the Spanish line, the Spanish opened fire. It was approximately 5:40 a.m. The Spanish shells fell short or passed over the American ships without hitting. The Spanish gunners were firing at the extreme range of their weapons, and their accuracy was poor. Dewey held his fire. He wanted to close the distance to ensure that his guns would be effective. The American ships continued to advance. At about 5,500 yards, Dewey turned to Captain Gridley and spoke the words that would become famous. "You may fire when you are ready, Gridley." It was a calm, understated order that perfectly captured Dewey's personality. There was no drama, no theatrics, just a simple instruction to begin the battle. Gridley relayed the order, and the Olympia's guns opened fire. The other American ships followed suit. The Battle of Manila Bay had begun in earnest. The American squadron adopted a tactic that Dewey had planned in advance. The ships would steam past the Spanish line on an elliptical course, firing their port guns as they passed, then turn and steam back, firing their starboard guns. This maneuver allowed the American ships to keep moving, which made them harder targets, while also allowing them to bring all their guns to bear at different times. It also gave the gun crews a chance to reload between passes. The Spanish fleet, anchored and stationary, could not maneuver to avoid fire. They were sitting ducks. The contrast in gunnery effectiveness was stark. The American gunners had been trained to aim carefully and fire deliberately. They were using modern range-finding equipment and techniques. Their guns were well maintained. Their ammunition was reliable and consistent. The result was that American shells were hitting Spanish ships with regularity. The Spanish gunners, by contrast, were firing rapidly but wildly. They were using older guns with inconsistent ammunition. They lacked modern range-finding equipment. Most of their shells were missing completely, falling short or passing over the American ships. The Americans made 5 passes along the Spanish line over the course of about 2 hours. Each pass brought devastation to the Spanish fleet. The Reina Cristina, Montojo's flagship, was hit repeatedly. Shells smashed into her superstructure, destroyed her guns, started fires, and killed her crew. Montojo himself was wounded. The ship was becoming a floating wreck. The Castilla, the old wooden-hulled cruiser, was set on fire and began to burn fiercely. The Don Antonio de Ulloa was hit so many times that she began to list heavily. The other Spanish ships were also taking damage, though at different rates, depending on their position in the line and their size. Around 7:30 a.m., after the 5th pass, Dewey received a report that alarmed him. The officer in charge of ammunition reported that only 15 rounds per gun remained. If this was true, the American squadron was running out of ammunition after just 2 hours of fighting. This would be a serious problem. Dewey could not afford to run out of ammunition with the Spanish fleet still partially intact. He made the decision to break off the engagement temporarily. He ordered the squadron to withdraw to the other side of the bay, out of range of the Spanish guns, to redistribute ammunition and give the crews a chance to rest and eat breakfast. This withdrawal puzzled the Spanish. From their perspective, the American ships had suddenly turned and sailed away. Some Spanish officers thought the Americans had been damaged and were retreating. There was even some premature celebration in Manila. The Spanish Governor-General sent a telegram to Madrid claiming a victory. The reality was very different. The Americans had not been damaged at all. Not a single American ship had been hit by Spanish fire. The only American casualties so far were a few men on the Baltimore who had been slightly injured when one of their own shells had malfunctioned. The American withdrawal was purely about ammunition management and crew welfare. When Dewey's ships had pulled back and the crews began checking ammunition stores more carefully, They discovered that the initial report had been wrong. There was plenty of ammunition. The confusion had arisen because of a miscommunication about ready ammunition versus reserve ammunition. The ready ammunition lockers, which held shells near the guns for quick access, were running low. But the reserve magazines, which held the bulk of the ammunition deep in the ships, were still well stocked. Once this was clarified, Dewey realized he could continue the battle without any problem. The break lasted about 2 hours. The crews ate breakfast, rested briefly, and prepared to resume the engagement. Meanwhile, the Spanish were dealing with disaster. The Reina Cristina was so badly damaged that Montojo ordered her abandoned. The crew evacuated the ship, and she was left to burn. Montojo transferred his flag to the Isla de Cuba. The Castilla was also burning and would soon sink. Several other Spanish ships were heavily damaged. At about 11:00 a.m., the American squadron returned to the attack. This time, Dewey ordered his ships to close the range even further to ensure maximum effectiveness. The Americans steamed to within 2,000 yards of the Spanish line and opened fire again. At this range, the American gunnery was devastatingly accurate. Spanish ships were being hit repeatedly. The Don Antonio de Ulloa took more hits and finally sank in shallow water, settling on the bottom with part of her superstructure still visible above the surface. The Castilla, already burning, capsized and sank. The smaller gunboats tried to escape, but were chased down and destroyed. The shore batteries at Cavite continued to fire, but they were ineffective. The American ships targeted the batteries and silenced them one by one. By early afternoon, it was over. The Spanish fleet had been completely destroyed. Every Spanish ship was either sunk, burning, or captured. The Cavite arsenal and naval station were in ruins. Spanish casualties were heavy. Nearly 400 Spanish sailors had been killed and wounded. By contrast, the American fleet had suffered 0 combat deaths. Not one American sailor had been killed by Spanish fire. There had been some injuries, mostly minor, and there was one death from heat stroke during the battle, but in terms of combat casualties, the Americans had achieved a perfect result. It was an almost unbelievable outcome, the kind of lopsided victory that military historians study as an example of what happens when a modern, well-trained force engages an obsolete, poorly prepared opponent. The tactical execution of the battle revealed the superiority of the American Navy in almost every dimension. The American ships were faster, more maneuverable, and better armed than the Spanish ships. The American crews were better trained and more disciplined. The American commanders were more experienced and made better decisions. Even the American coal was better. The Olympia and her sister ships burned anthracite coal, which produced less smoke and was more efficient. The Spanish ships burned bituminous coal, which created thick black smoke that obscured visibility and made the ships easier to see from a distance. This might seem like a minor detail, but in naval warfare, every advantage matters. After the battle, Dewey had to decide what to do next. He had destroyed the Spanish fleet, but he did not have enough troops to capture Manila itself. The city was defended by Spanish army units, and Dewey had only the sailors and marines from his ships, a few hundred men at most. He could bombard Manila from the bay, but that would risk killing civilians and destroying property without necessarily forcing a Spanish surrender. Dewey decided to establish a blockade of Manila Bay and wait for American ground forces to arrive. He sent messages to Washington reporting his victory and requesting troops. He also made contact with Filipino rebels who were fighting for independence from Spain. This is where the story of the Battle of Manila Bay intersects with the larger and more complicated story of the Philippines and American imperialism. The Filipino people had been fighting for independence from Spain since 1896. The rebellion was led by Emilio Aguinaldo, a young Filipino revolutionary who had been leading guerrilla operations against Spanish forces. When Dewey arrived and destroyed the Spanish fleet, Aguinaldo saw an opportunity. He believed that the Americans were coming to help the Filipinos gain independence, just as the Americans had declared they were going to help Cuba gain independence from Spain. Dewey met with Aguinaldo and encouraged the Filipino rebels to continue fighting against the Spanish. The Americans provided some arms and support to the rebels. Filipino forces surrounded Manila on land, while the American fleet blockaded the bay from the sea. But there was a fundamental misunderstanding, or perhaps a deliberate deception, about American intentions. Aguinaldo and many Filipinos believed that America would help them achieve independence and then leave. Some American officials allowed this belief to persist because it was useful to have the Filipinos fighting the Spanish. But other American officials, including President McKinley and many members of Congress, had different ideas. They saw the Philippines as a potential American possession, a colony that could serve American strategic and economic interests in Asia. This gap between Filipino expectations and American intentions would lead to tragedy. In August 1898, American ground forces finally arrived in Manila. General Wesley Merritt commanded an expedition of about 10,000 American soldiers. With the American fleet in the bay and American troops on land, the Spanish position in Manila became hopeless. On August 13, after a brief battle that was mostly for show, the Spanish surrendered Manila to the Americans. Notably, the Americans did not allow Filipino forces to enter Manila. American and Spanish officers had actually coordinated the surrender to exclude the Filipinos, even though Filipino rebels had been fighting the Spanish for years and had been surrounding the city. This was a clear signal that the Americans did not view the Filipinos as allies or partners, but as subjects or obstacles. The Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the Spanish-American War in December 1898, ceded the Philippines to the United States. Spain received $20 million in compensation, a pittance for a colony it had held for over 300 years. The Filipino people were not consulted. Their rebellion against Spain was simply transferred into a rebellion against the United States. From 1899 to 1902, and in some areas for years beyond that, American forces fought a brutal counterinsurgency campaign against Filipino independence fighters. The Philippine-American War cost far more American lives than the Spanish-American War had. It also cost hundreds of thousands of Filipino lives, mostly civilians who died from disease, starvation, and the effects of warfare. The Battle of Manila Bay is often celebrated in American history as a great victory, and in purely military terms it was. Dewey's tactical execution was nearly flawless. His victory was complete and achieved at minimal cost. The battle made Dewey a national hero. When he returned to the United States in 1899, he was greeted with parades and celebrations. Congress promoted him to the rank of Admiral of the Navy, a rank created specifically for him. There was even brief talk of Dewey running for president, though that came to nothing. But the consequences of the victory were far more complicated than the celebration suggested. The immediate strategic impact of the Battle of Manila Bay was to demonstrate that the United States had a capable blue water navy that could project power across the Pacific. This was significant. For most of American history, the U.S. Navy had been primarily a coastal defense force. Even during the Civil War, most naval operations had been close to American shores. But by 1898, the Navy had been modernized. New steel ships with modern guns had been built. Naval officers had been trained in new tactics and technologies. The victory at Manila Bay showed that these investments had paid off. The United States could now compete with European powers on the world's oceans. The battle also had diplomatic implications. European powers had been watching the Spanish-American War with interest. Some had been skeptical about American military capabilities. The quick, decisive victory at Manila Bay changed those perceptions. Britain, in particular, took note. British strategists began to see the United States as a potential partner rather than a rival. This would have long-term consequences for the Anglo-American relationship in the 20th century. Germany, which also had imperial ambitions in the Pacific, was less pleased. German ships had been present in Manila Bay during and after the battle, officially to protect German commercial interests, but there was tension between German and American forces. The incident contributed to a growing rivalry between the United States and Germany that would have implications in the decades ahead. The economic impact of acquiring the Philippines was mixed. American businesses had hoped that the Philippines would serve as a gateway to Asian markets, particularly China. In practice, this proved to be more complicated than anticipated. The Philippines required significant investment in infrastructure and governance. The cost of suppressing the Filipino independence movement and then administering the islands was substantial. Some American exports to Asia did increase, but it is debatable whether the economic benefits of holding the Philippines ever justified the costs. The moral and political impact of the Battle of Manila Bay and the subsequent acquisition of the Philippines was perhaps the most significant and contested aspect of the whole affair. The United States had gone to war with Spain, at least officially, to liberate Cuba from Spanish oppression. The Teller Amendment had explicitly promised that the United States would not annex Cuba, but the Philippines presented a different situation, or at least American leaders claimed it did. The argument was made that the Filipinos were not ready for self-government, that they needed American guidance and protection, that abandoning them would leave them vulnerable to other imperial powers like Germany or Japan. This was the language of paternalism and racism that characterized much of the imperial discourse of the era. Not all Americans agreed with this logic. There was a significant anti-imperialist movement in the United States that opposed the acquisition of the Philippines. This movement included diverse figures like Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and former President Grover Cleveland. They argued that imperialism contradicted American values of self-determination and democracy. They pointed out the hypocrisy of fighting a war to liberate Cuba while simultaneously subjugating the Philippines. They warned that empire would corrupt American democracy and drag the United States into foreign conflicts. The debate over the Philippines was intense and divided the country. In the Senate, the Treaty of Paris passed by just one vote more than the required two-thirds majority. It was that close. If two senators had voted differently, the United States might not have acquired the Philippines. But the treaty passed, and the United States became, officially, a colonial power with overseas possessions. This marked a fundamental shift in American foreign policy and national identity. The United States was no longer just a continental republic. It was now an empire, whether Americans wanted to use that word or not. Dewey himself seemed relatively untroubled by these larger questions. He was a military officer who had been given a mission, and he had accomplished it brilliantly. He believed in American power and American expansion. He thought the United States had a right and even a duty to play a larger role in world affairs. In this, he was typical of many Americans of his generation who embraced imperialism as a natural extension of manifest destiny. The idea that had driven expansion across the North American continent was now being applied globally. Looking back at the Battle of Manila Bay from the perspective of more than a century later, we can see it as a pivotal moment in American history. It was the moment when the United States decisively announced its arrival as a global power. It demonstrated American naval capability. It resulted in the acquisition of a significant overseas territory. It set patterns that would shape American foreign policy for decades. The United States would continue to intervene in Asia, would continue to maintain military bases in the Pacific, would continue to see itself as a Pacific power with interests and responsibilities in the region. But the battle also revealed the dangers and contradictions of imperialism. The easy military victory masked the difficult political and moral questions that came after. What right did the United States have to rule over the Filipino people against their will? How could America reconcile its democratic values with colonial governance? What were the true costs of empire, not just in dollars, but in lives and principles? These questions were debated vigorously in 1898 and 1899, but ultimately the imperialists won. The United States kept the Philippines and would hold them for nearly half a century, until granting independence after World War II. The technical aspects of the battle itself remain impressive even by modern standards. The American gunnery was remarkably accurate given the technology of the time. The squadron's coordination and maneuver were executed flawlessly. The maintenance and logistics that allowed the American ships to travel thousands of miles and fight a battle without any mechanical failures was a testament to the professionalism of the Navy. Dewey's planning and leadership were exemplary. He had prepared thoroughly, made good decisions under pressure, and achieved his objectives completely. The Spanish, by contrast, were doomed from the start. Admiral Montojo knew his fleet was inadequate, but he had no good choices. He could not refuse to fight. That would have been dishonorable and would have accomplished nothing. He could not withdraw his ships to Spain. They were not capable of such a voyage, and Spain needed them in the Philippines. He could not win a battle against a superior force. So he chose to fight in a position where his men could survive the inevitable defeat. This was a rational decision given his circumstances, but it meant that the battle was never really in doubt. From the moment Dewey entered Manila Bay, the outcome was predetermined. This raises an interesting question about the significance of battles in history. The Battle of Manila Bay was decisive in its immediate results, but was it really a contest? When one side is so superior to the other that the outcome is certain from the beginning, can we even call it a battle, or is it more like an execution? The Spanish fought bravely. They stood their ground and fired their guns until their ships were sinking beneath them. But they never had a chance. The Battle of Manila Bay was less a test of military skill and more a demonstration of the consequences of technological and organizational superiority. This pattern would repeat itself in other colonial conflicts. European and American forces, equipped with modern weapons and supported by industrial economies, would defeat non-Western forces again and again. These victories were often portrayed as evidence of Western superiority, but they really demonstrated the advantages that came from industrialization, not any inherent cultural or racial superiority. The Spanish were Europeans with a long military tradition, but their fleet in 1898 was obsolete. The Americans had a modern fleet. That made all the difference. The story of the Battle of Manila Bay is also a story about individuals. Dewey became the face of the victory, and rightly so, but there were hundreds of other men who made the victory possible. The sailors who manned the guns and kept the engines running, the officers who relayed orders and coordinated the ship's operations, the engineers who had designed the ships, the workers in American shipyards who had built them, the logisticians who had supplied them, the intelligence officers who had gathered information about Spanish defenses. Victory in war is never the product of one person, no matter how competent or famous that person is. It is the product of systems, organizations, and the collective efforts of many people. On the Spanish side, there were also individuals whose stories deserve recognition. Admiral Montojo, who led his men into a battle he knew he could not win and was wounded in the process. The Spanish sailors who kept fighting even as their ships were being blown apart around them. The Spanish commanders who tried to maintain order and discipline in impossible circumstances. These men were not villains. They were professionals doing their duty under terrible conditions. The fact that they lost does not diminish their courage or their commitment. The civilians caught in the middle of the battle and its aftermath also deserve consideration. Manila was a city of hundreds of thousands of people. The Spanish community, the Filipino community, the Chinese community, and others all lived there. When Dewey's ships arrived and began bombarding Spanish positions, these civilians had to deal with the fear and uncertainty of being in a war zone. After the battle, they had to navigate the transition from Spanish rule to American occupation. For many Filipinos, this transition brought hope at first, hope that the Americans would help them achieve independence. When that hope was betrayed, it brought anger and resistance. The civilians who got caught in the Philippine-American War that followed paid a terrible price. The Battle of Manila Bay lasted about 7 hours, but its effects lasted decades. American control of the Philippines would continue until 1946. During that time, Americans built schools and roads and hospitals in the Philippines. They also exploited Filipino resources and labor. They shaped Filipino society and culture in profound ways. The relationship was paternalistic and unequal. Filipinos were not citizens of the United States, but they were subjects. They were expected to be grateful for American rule, even though they had not asked for it. World War II would bring new complications. When Japan invaded the Philippines in 1941, the United States was forced to defend its colony. The Philippines became a major theater of the war. American and Filipino forces fought together against the Japanese, and the Philippines suffered terribly under Japanese occupation. After the war, the United States finally granted the Philippines independence in 1946, nearly 50 years after Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet in Manila Bay. But independence did not end American influence. The United States maintained military bases in the Philippines for decades after independence. American investment and American culture remained dominant in the Philippines. The relationship that began with the Battle of Manila Bay shaped both countries in ways that continue to this day. From a purely military history perspective, the Battle of Manila Bay is studied as an example of decisive naval action. Dewey's tactics, his use of the elliptical maneuver to maximize firepower while minimizing exposure, became a case study in naval warfare. The battle demonstrated the importance of gunnery training and fire control. It showed the value of reconnaissance and intelligence. It proved that a well-prepared force could achieve overwhelming victory against an inferior opponent. These lessons were absorbed by naval officers around the world and influenced naval thinking in the years leading up to World War I. The battle also had technological implications. The performance of American ships and guns at Manila Bay encouraged further investment in naval technology. The Navy continued to build more modern ships and to develop better weapons systems. The importance of long-range, accurate gunnery became a central focus of naval development. This would lead to the dreadnought revolution in the early 1900s, when a new generation of battleships with uniform main armaments and advanced fire control systems made all earlier battleships obsolete. One of the remarkable aspects of the Battle of Manila Bay, and something that set it apart from many other battles, was the low cost in American lives. The fact that not a single American sailor was killed by enemy fire in a major naval battle was almost unprecedented. It happened because of the combination of American technological superiority, Spanish weakness, and good fortune. If the Spanish had been more accurate with their gunnery, if they had been able to hit the American ships with some of their thousands of shells fired, the outcome would still likely have been an American victory, but it would have come at a higher cost. The zero combat death figure became a powerful propaganda point. It suggested that America could project power and achieve victories without the terrible costs that characterized so many wars. But this created an unrealistic expectation. The Spanish-American War as a whole was remarkably cheap in American combat deaths. Most American casualties came from disease, particularly tropical diseases like yellow fever and malaria, rather than from combat. This led some Americans to think that future wars might also be quick, easy, and relatively bloodless. This was a dangerous illusion. The Philippine-American War that followed would be much more costly. And the great wars of the 20th century, World War I and World War II, would demonstrate that modern warfare could be extraordinarily destructive and deadly. The Battle of Manila Bay was not a model for future conflicts. It was an anomaly, a result of unique circumstances that would not be repeated. The legacy of Commodore Dewey is interesting to consider. He was a genuine hero who had achieved a great military victory, but his fame faded relatively quickly. By the 1910s, he was already becoming a figure of the past. He lived until 1917 and remained on active duty until his death, but he never commanded in another major action. He served in administrative roles and on various boards and commissions. When he died in 1917, just as the United States was entering World War I, he was honored and mourned, but he was no longer the towering figure he had been in 1898. Later generations of Americans would know little about him. The Battle of Manila Bay would be overshadowed by the world wars and by more recent conflicts. Today, Dewey is a relatively obscure figure, known mainly to military history enthusiasts and students of the Spanish-American War. This raises questions about historical memory and how we remember military victories. Some battles and commanders remain famous across generations. Others fade into obscurity. The Battle of Manila Bay was a significant event, a turning point in American history, but it does not have the same place in popular memory as battles like Gettysburg or D-Day. Perhaps this is because the battle itself, while impressive in execution, was not a closely contested struggle. Perhaps it is because the consequences of the battle, particularly the acquisition of the Philippines and the subsequent Philippine-American War, are morally ambiguous and uncomfortable. Perhaps it is simply that there have been so many battles in American history that only a few can remain prominently in the national consciousness. The Spanish perspective on the Battle of Manila Bay is worth considering. For Spain, the battle was part of a larger disaster. The Spanish-American War was a catastrophe for Spain. The country lost the remnants of its once vast empire. Cuba, Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines were all gone. Spain received a modest financial compensation, but that did not make up for the loss of territory, prestige, and power. The defeat led to soul-searching in Spain about what had gone wrong. Some blamed the government for allowing the military to decay. Others blamed the military for incompetence. Still others blamed external forces, the Americans or the Cuban and Filipino rebels. The defeat contributed to political instability in Spain and to a sense of national decline. For Admiral Montojo and the other Spanish officers who fought at Manila Bay, the battle was a personal tragedy. Montojo was court-martialed after the war and accused of negligence for losing the battle. He defended himself by arguing that he had done the best he could with the forces available to him. The court eventually acquitted him, recognizing that he had been placed in an impossible situation. But his career was over, and he lived the rest of his life under the shadow of defeat. The Spanish sailors who survived the battle faced similar difficulties. Some had been wounded and required medical care that was not always available. Others struggled to find work in a Spain that was economically depressed and politically unstable. The human cost of the Battle of Manila Bay was not borne equally by both sides. In the broader context of the Spanish-American War, the Battle of Manila Bay was the first major American victory. It came just days after the start of the war and set the tone for what was to come. The American victories continued to mount. The Spanish Caribbean fleet was destroyed at Santiago de Cuba in July. American troops seized Puerto Rico with little resistance. The war was over in less than 4 months. The ease and speed of the American victory surprised many observers and confirmed the impression that the United States had arrived as a major military power. But it also confirmed the impression that Spain was a declining power that could no longer defend its empire. The relationship between military power and international influence was clearly demonstrated by the Spanish-American War. Spain had been considered a great power for centuries, but by 1898, it lacked the military strength to back up its pretensions. The United States, by contrast, had built up its military capabilities to the point where it could challenge and defeat a European power. This shift in the balance of power had been building for decades, but the Spanish-American War made it obvious and undeniable. After 1898, the United States would be taken seriously as a player in international politics in a way that it had not been before. The Battle of Manila Bay also illustrated the importance of logistics and preparation in warfare. Dewey's victory was not just the result of superior ships and guns, though those were important. It was also the result of thorough preparation. Dewey had spent months preparing for this battle. He had stockpiled supplies, drilled his crews, gathered intelligence, and planned his approach. When war came, he was ready. The Spanish, by contrast, had not prepared adequately. Their ships were poorly maintained, their crews were undertrained, their intelligence about American capabilities was limited. They were not ready for war, and it showed. This is a lesson that applies beyond just naval warfare. Success in any complex endeavor requires preparation. It requires thinking ahead, gathering resources, training personnel, and planning for contingencies. The Battle of Manila Bay was won before it was fought, in the months of preparation that Dewey undertook while his ships were based in Hong Kong. The actual battle was just the execution of plans that had been carefully laid out in advance. The role of technology in the battle cannot be overstated. The American ships were modern and well-maintained. They had modern guns with reliable ammunition. They had better armor, better engines, better fire control systems. The Spanish ships were obsolete. They had older guns with defective ammunition. They had weaker armor, slower engines, and primitive fire control. In any contest between modern and obsolete technology, assuming competent operators, the modern technology will win. This was true in 1898, and it remains true today. Technological superiority is not everything in war, but it is a significant advantage. However, technology alone does not guarantee victory. The technology must be properly used. This requires training, leadership, and doctrine. The American Navy had all three. The sailors had been trained to use their weapons effectively. The officers had been trained to make good tactical decisions. The Navy as an institution had developed doctrines and procedures that worked. The Spanish Navy had fallen behind in all these areas. Even if the Spanish had been given American ships, it is not clear that they would have fought more effectively, because the problems went beyond just the quality of the hardware. The cultural and psychological factors in the battle were also significant. The American sailors were confident. They believed in their ships, their commanders, and their cause. They expected to win. The Spanish sailors were in a much more difficult psychological position. They knew their ships were inferior. They knew they were outnumbered in terms of effective firepower. They were fighting far from home with no prospect of reinforcement. It is remarkable that they fought as well as they did under these circumstances. The fact that they stood their ground and continued to fire even as their ships were being destroyed speaks to their courage and discipline. After the battle, Manila Bay became a symbol. For Americans, it symbolized national power and the arrival of the United States on the world stage. For Filipinos, it initially symbolized hope for liberation from Spanish rule, but later came to symbolize betrayal when the Americans chose to occupy the Philippines rather than grant independence. For the Spanish, it symbolized defeat and the loss of empire. Symbols are powerful things. They shape how people understand events and how they remember them. The Battle of Manila Bay has been symbolized in different ways by different people, and these different symbolic meanings have shaped its place in history. In American popular culture, the Battle of Manila Bay was celebrated extensively in the years immediately following the battle. There were songs written about it, paintings depicting it, speeches praising it. Dewey was featured in advertisements for products ranging from chewing gum to sewing machines. The Olympia herself became a tourist attraction when she was eventually retired from service. The ship is now a museum in Philadelphia, one of the few surviving American warships from the pre-dreadnought era. Visitors can walk the decks where Dewey stood and see the guns that fired on the Spanish fleet. It is a tangible connection to a moment in history that shaped the modern world. The battle's place in military education and strategic thinking is also worth noting. Naval academies around the world studied the Battle of Manila Bay. The tactics Dewey used were analyzed. The mistakes the Spanish made were identified. The battle became a teaching tool, a way to illustrate principles of naval warfare. Students at the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis learned about Dewey's elliptical maneuver and his emphasis on accurate gunnery. They learned about the importance of reconnaissance and intelligence. They learned about the value of keeping the initiative and forcing the enemy to fight on your terms. These lessons, derived from a 7-hour battle in 1898, influenced naval thinking for decades. One could argue that the Battle of Manila Bay was too easy, that it taught lessons that would not apply in more evenly matched contests. When both sides have comparable technology and training, battles are much more difficult and costly. The easy victory at Manila Bay might have created overconfidence that would be costly in future conflicts. This is always a danger when a military wins too easily. It can lead to underestimating future opponents and overestimating one's own capabilities. The U.S. Navy would face much tougher challenges in World War I and especially in World War II, when fighting against the Japanese Navy in the Pacific. Those battles would be far more difficult and costly than Manila Bay. In conclusion, the Battle of Manila Bay was a pivotal moment in American history. It was a military triumph that demonstrated American naval power and helped establish the United States as a global force. It resulted in the acquisition of the Philippines and marked America's entry into the age of imperialism. But it also raised profound questions about American values and identity. Could a nation founded on principles of self-determination and democracy justify ruling over other peoples against their will? The debate over this question divided Americans at the time and continues to resonate in discussions about American foreign policy today. The battle itself lasted only 7 hours and resulted in a complete American victory with almost no American casualties. But the consequences of that victory lasted for decades and shaped the course of the 20th century. Commodore George Dewey sailed into Manila Bay on the morning of May 1, 1898, and destroyed a Spanish fleet. In doing so, he helped set in motion changes that would transform both America and the Philippines, for better and for worse, in ways that neither he nor anyone else at the time could have fully anticipated. The Battle of Manila Bay was over in a morning, but we are still living with its aftermath.